He was one of the most infamous serial killers of all time, a terrifying presence that terrorized the streets of London in the late 1800s. The scariest part of all? He's never been caught. To this day, his identity remains a secret. So sit back, get comfy, and enjoy tonight's Sleepless Night Tale. The year is 1888. Gas lamps flickered in the cold, rain-slick cobblestone streets of London's East End, more specifically, Whitechapel. This was an area known for its run-down state and high crime rates, and of course, the plights of the locals, trying to make ends meet in early Victorian England. But tonight, something dark was about to unfold. Mary Ann Nichols, a destitute woman in her 40s, lay sprawled in an alley. She had been murdered. She was the first victim that we know of. As soon as she was discovered on August 31st, fear gripped the East End. The local residents were petrified by the severity and disturbing nature of the crime. This was not just a regular murder, but something more macabre, and that's because her throat had been slashed and her abdomen horribly mutilated. As you can imagine, the local papers picked up this story right away, adding to the heightened fear and causing widespread panic among the locals. The headlines dug into the gruesome nature of the murder and the seemingly randomness of the attack. It shocked and confused everyone. But unfortunately, this was only the beginning. Less than 10 days later, there would be another killing. Annie Chapman, a local florist and casual prostitute in her 40s. She was found dead on the early morning of September 8th, 1888, on Hanbury Street in Whitechapel. And only now did the police start to piece together that the two murders might be linked. They said that this murder was even more horrific than the previous one. Those that bore witness to the shocking sight described the neck wounds that were so severe that her head was barely still attached. And if that weren't bad enough, it was also noted that several of her internal organs had been removed. The community response was shock and outrage. Calls for police intervention and social reform began spreading. Many women were afraid to walk alone at night, none more so than local sex workers who were already the target of violence as it was. Now, there was an all-new fear to worry about, and the public, they wanted justice. With there being now two horrific crimes of this nature, the police began investigating, but their efforts were met with widespread criticism. Many of the residents said that the police were not doing enough to protect the residents of Whitechapel. Amidst the outrage and calls for justice, no one knew who was responsible for the attacks or why this was happening. But all of that changed just a few weeks later, on September 27th, 1888, when the Central News Agency received a letter simply titled, "Dear Boss," and signed by Jack the Ripper. The letter was written in red ink and went into graphic detail about the murders and Jack's appreciation of the attention he was receiving in the press. It also expressed his intention to commit more murders, specifically calling out that he was targeting prostitutes. In his letter, he taunted the police for their inability to catch him and that they would soon be hearing from him again. The grim letter sent shockwaves through the public as soon as it was published by the local papers, and the series of events that followed were as unforgettable as they were grim. Only 3 days later, there would be not one but two new murders, and the way in which they happened was a little different from how they had occurred before. The first poor soul to fall victim that night was Elizabeth Stride, later known as Long Liz, a 44-year-old cleaner found in Henriques Street. She was found with her throat cut and her trachea severed. However, this murder was different in that there were no abdominal mutilations or organs removed. This small difference in detail led many people to believe that the Ripper had been interrupted while performing the deed, which means only one thing: he may have been spotted. Yes, there might have been a witness who saw this happening, although we may never know. Not even 1 hour later, another killing took place. This time, Jack the Ripper completed his duty uninterrupted. And what they found in Meter Square was truly appalling. Catherine Eddowes, another sex worker in her 40s, was found dead and viciously mutilated. Her kidney and part of her uterus were removed in the attack, making it one of the most grisly attacks ever seen at the time. At that point, the community had been fed up with the violence and the police's inability to catch the culprit behind these evil slaughters. Many began taking matters into their own hands. Vigilance groups began to form in the local community, none more famous than the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, led by former soldier and respected local businessman George Lusk. He was one of the first to discover the gruesome scene of Catherine Eddowes. George's contribution to both the community and the investigation helped bring the police and the public a step closer to understanding who was behind these horrific crimes. George recognized the surgical precision of the wounds and helped the police in gathering information and leads to track the monster behind the attack. He must have been onto something, because 16 days later, one of the most shocking discoveries in the entire case was made, and it came in the form of a parcel addressed to George, along with a letter ominously titled, "From Hell." George leaned in and unboxed the package, and when he looked inside, shockwaves were sent down his spine. Inside the box were human remains. It was half a kidney, which was believed to have come from Catherine Eddowes. In the letter, the writer had claimed to have eaten the other half of the kidney. Panic surged through George's body as fear for his family and himself took over. The Ripper had singled him out. He pushed on and read the rest of the letter. The sender went on to taunt him, saying that the next thing he would receive would be the knife that was used for the murder. The second letter was notably different from the one received by the Central News Agency, both in terms of handwriting and the literary skills used. It appeared this more recent letter had far poorer language skills and an untidy handwriting. This sparked much debate in the authenticity of the letters sent by the Ripper. Nonetheless, this was a terrifying break in the case that would mark the beginning of even more grim things to come. It was November 9th, and a woman named Mary Jane Kelly was making her way home from a night out. According to those that supposedly saw her that night, she was making her way home from a local pub that she would often go to. She was staying at a lodge at 13 Miller's Court, Dorset Street. In the early hours of the morning, there were reports of screams, but these were dismissed because the area was often victim to these types of things and nefarious ongoings. However, the reason behind those screams and what would be found the next morning would haunt the public for over 100 years to come. That's how bad it was. The following morning, Mr. Thomas Bowyer entered the property to collect overdue rent from Mary. He slowly opened the door and stumbled upon a gruesome and unspeakable scene that surely scarred him for the rest of his life. The entire room was covered in blood. Mary was dead on the bed, her throat slashed, and her body severely mutilated and defiled. The killer had gone to such lengths as to remove and scatter her internal organs across the room in a macabre display of brutality. It is said that the sight shocked even the most seasoned of investigators, who speculated that this attack and dismemberment must have taken well over 2 hours to perform. Mary Jane's case would be the final and most gruesome of the Ripper murders. The investigator leading the charge was Mr. Frederick Abberline, a seasoned Metro policeman who knew the criminal landscape well, and he believed the acts were possibly linked to a gang, but sadly, despite his tireless efforts and coordinations, he had little success in finding out the identity of Jack the Ripper. One suspect that came under scrutiny was Albert Kadosh, a local butcher. Because of his experience with blades, his bloodstained apron, and nervous demeanor, he looked suspicious in the eyes of investigators. He was also rumored to have been spotted near the locations where the victims were found, but the evidence was murky at best. Another person that was suspected was Mary Jane's on and off boyfriend at the time, Joseph Barnett, but he was quickly cleared as he had a concrete alibi after leaving her place the previous night at 8 p.m. However, when it comes to theories, one man stood out at the time: Montague John Druitt, a local teacher and doctor with a keen interest in surgery and a rocky past, having been dismissed from school in Blackheath in his youth. Druitt went missing shortly after Mary Jane's death and was later found in the River Thames. Although he was suspected, he was never definitively linked to any of the murders, and some doubt his involvement because of a letter found which suggested he may have been responsible for his own death after all. The story of Jack the Ripper has plagued investigators and the public for over a century, leading to a new discovery more than 100 years later in 2014. With the use of modern technology and DNA testing, one investigation suggests that they might have indirect evidence of who the Ripper might be. A blood-soaked shawl was found at the scene of the crime of the Ripper's last victim, Mary Jane Kelly. Mitochondrial testing revealed that the DNA found on the shawl was a relative match to one of the suspects at the time, Aaron Kosminski, a Polish barber institutionalized in a mental asylum for pulling a knife on his sister. Even though this evidence does link him to the crime indirectly, it's important to note that many people share similar mitochondrial DNA. However, it's probably the closest evidence found to this day. We may never know the identity of the infamous serial killer, or why his spree suddenly stopped, but it does lead one to believe that he either died, ran away, or was otherwise detained under different circumstances. One thing we know for sure is that the case of Jack the Ripper had a profound impact on Victorian society and police procedures at large. So tell me, who do you think the killer was?
Sleepless Night Tales,
Thanks for listening to today's story. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like these types of videos, consider subscribing so you don't miss any of our future uploads. If you want to hear more, you can check out some of our other videos right here. Until next time, good night.